Tomorrow you are giving a show, and you need men to fight in it. You do not buy them. You rent them, the way a farmer rents a mule. The contract has 2 prices on it for the same man. If he walks out of the arena in one piece, you pay 20 denarii. The Romans had a phrase for that fee, pro sudore, for the sweat. If he is killed or crippled past use, you pay 1,000. 20 for his sweat, 1,000 for his body. So the most expensive thing that could happen to you in that building was never losing a fight. It was a man dying in one. This is not a poet writing about cruelty. It is a law textbook. And the jurist who wrote it down was not troubled by the dying. He was troubled by the filing, because in Roman law, these are not the same kind of contract. The man who came back was a rental. The man who did not was a sale. Rome had a price for a man's sweat, a price for his death, and a clerk who knew the difference. Step back from the sand for a moment, because one question comes before all the others. Not who died in that building, who paid for it. The outer wall alone took more than 100,000 cubic meters of travertine, cut in the quarries at Tivoli and dragged into Rome on ox carts, block by block. None of it was set in mortar. The stones are held together by iron clamps hidden in the joints, some 300 tons of metal, doing the job cement does today. Nobody assembles that by accident, and nobody donates it. Somebody signed for it. And for a few centuries, the building said out loud who that was. High across the front there was a dedication in bronze letters, each one pinned into the stone. Not a single letter survives. What survives is the holes they were pinned into. In 1995, an epigrapher named Gaius Alfoldi sat down and read the holes. Not the inscription, there is no inscription. The pattern of empty pin marks in the travertine. And a sentence came back out of the stone. This amphitheater, it said, was built ex manubiis. Manubii is not tax revenue and not a public grant. It is the commander's personal share of what an army takes in the field. The building was not funded by the state. It was funded by loot. Whose loot? The stone does not say. And this is the point where an honest account has to slow down instead of speeding up. Vespasian had exactly one great campaign behind him, the war in Judea. His son took Jerusalem and burned the temple. The triumph came through Rome the following year. Josephus watched that triumph. He was a captured commander who became a client of the family that built this arena, so read him knowing that. He still leaves a figure that is hard to invent.
In Syria, a pound weight of gold was sold for half its former value.
That is not the language of a robbery. That is what emptying one temple did to the price of gold across an entire province. A theft you can measure on a market. Prisoners taken in that war by his own count, 97,000. He was writing for the winners, so treat it as their figure rather than as an audit. The popular version says 100,000 of them were marched to Rome to build the Colosseum. No ancient source says that. It is a modern sentence repeated until it began to sound old. What is documented is quieter and worse. 2,500 Jewish prisoners were killed in games at Caesarea, in the victory shows of that same war, put on by that same family. So the honest line runs like this. The money came out of a war, and people from that war died in arenas. The receipt tying one directly to the other was never carved into anything. The ground the building stands on says something as well, and that part is not in dispute at all. Nero had fenced off the center of Rome for a private palace, with an ornamental lake laid out in front of it. The new dynasty filled that lake in and built the amphitheater on top of it. Suetonius says the idea was older than any of them, an amphitheater in the middle of the city, something Augustus had wanted. Vespasian put it exactly where a tyrant's water had been. Give the people back the ground the last man took. Pay for it with gold taken from somebody else entirely. As politics, that is close to perfect. And in those same years, the same emperor brought back a tax on the urine collected out of the public latrines. It was raw material. The laundries used it to clean wool. His son said it was beneath the family. Vespasian held up a coin from the first collection, put it under the young man's nose, and asked him whether it smelled. Money does not smell. Not coming out of a latrine, and not coming out of a temple. The man who said it built this arena with both. Which brings us back to the holes in the front wall. because Alfoldi did not find one inscription in them. He found two, in the same set of marks. The first belongs to Vespasian. Then, after his death, a single letter, a T, was pushed into the front of the line, and the two letters beside it were shifted along to make room. Titus wrote himself into his father's building by adding one letter to it. We only know because the man doing the work had to drill fresh holes to do it. Other readings exist and epigraphers still argue about them. But they argue about whose name was up there. Nobody argues about the holes. So the money was war money. The next question is what that money bought. And here Rome kept far better records than anyone would like it to have kept. The key document is not a chronicle and not a poem about blood on the sand. It is a textbook written for law students in the middle of the 2nd century. Gaius sets his students a problem. A man supplies gladiators for a show. 20 denarii for each fighter who walks out unhurt. 1,000 for each one killed or crippled past use. And the question he asks about that arrangement is not a moral one. It is administrative. Which kind of contract has just been signed here?
Locatio conductio, emptio venditio.
Hire or sale? His answer is that it depends entirely on whether the man walks back through the gate at the end of the afternoon. The fighter who came out alive had been hired, the same legal category as renting a mule, a cart, or a field hand for the day. The one who did not come out had been sold. Death converted the contract and the body became, in law, goods delivered against an order. It is worth saying carefully that the jurist is not being cruel here. Cruelty would require him to have an opinion about it. He is filing. And the numbers in his exercise were not invented for the classroom either. We can check them against the market, because the state wrote the market down. Marcus Aurelius and his son put a ruling through the Senate fixing what a fighter was allowed to cost. A bronze copy of that ruling was dug up in Spain, at Italica. It works like a tax band. If the budget of the whole show sat in the lowest bracket, a first-class fighter could cost at most 5,000 sesterces. At the top bracket, where a show ran to 150,000, the ceiling for a single man was 12,000. Above that, the sponsor was breaking the law. The 1,000 denarii in the textbook works out at 4,000 sesterces, sitting squarely inside that real market. Gaius was not inventing a figure. He was quoting the going rate. Underneath the law sat the trade itself. A lanista bought men, housed them, fed them, trained them, and rented them out by the day, like equipment. It paid well, and it was despised. A lanista carried infamia, the same legal stain as a pimp or an actor. Rome took the service and kept the man outside the room. And not all of the fighters were slaves. Free citizens signed up, usually because they owed somebody money, and the contract they signed came with an oath.
Uri, vinciri, verberari, ferroque necari.
To be burned, to be chained, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. A free man said that out loud, for a fee, for an agreed number of fights. Now put the two prices from the textbook back on the table, and watch what they do to the show itself. A sponsor who let a beaten man live paid the day rate for him. A sponsor who gave the crowd what it was screaming for paid 50 times that. Mercy had a price. Blood had a price. And mercy was the cheap one. The crowd's own records agree. On the tombs along the roads out of Pompeii, fans kept score of the fights, the way people keep score of anything they bet on. The marks are short. V for victor, M for misses, sent away alive, P for perished. Across the surviving scores, M turns up far more often than P does. Hilarius fought 14 times and won 12 of them. He lost to a beginner called Marcus Attilius in front of everybody, and he walked away from it. None of that makes the arena a safe place to work. It makes it a business with an accountant in the back office, and the accountant preferred him breathing. The most famous exception to the rule turns out to belong to us rather than to them. Flamma, on a headstone in Sicily. 34 fights, dead at 30. The legend attached to him says he was offered his freedom 4 times over and turned it down every time. The stone says misses 4 times, spared. Nothing on it about an offer, and nothing about a refusal. We added that part because it made a better story. One line of one textbook holds the whole system up. The man who came back was rented. The man who did not come back was sold. Every price so far has been the price of a person. There was a more expensive line further down the same invoice. The building opened with 100 days of games. Suetonius, writing close to the event, gives one hard figure: 5,000 animals killed in a single day of it. Cassius Dio gives 9,000 across the whole 100 days. That is the number everyone quotes, and it needs a label attached to it. Dio's text for these years is lost. What survives is a summary made by a Byzantine monk 1,000 years later. And even there, the total is an addition of categories, boars and cranes included. So, thousands certainly, 9,000 reportedly. That difference is most of what separates history from a caption. Animals are where the money becomes visible, because every animal had to be taken alive, fed, shipped, and warehoused for months before anybody sat down to watch it die. A villa in Sicily at Piazza Armerina has that entire chain laid into the floor in mosaic. 60 meters of corridor, wall to wall, all of it about supply. And what the owner put on his floor is not the kill, it is the logistics. Nets, cages, ox carts, a gangway, a ship being loaded at the dock. A rich man paid for 60 meters of supply chain in colored stone. The status symbol was never the lion. It was being able to move one across a sea. The only real price list that survives comes late. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, more than 2 centuries after the arena first opened its gates. Different century, different coin, a currency collapse sitting in between. So it can be read against itself, and never against the textbook. That rule matters in about 30 seconds. Read against itself, it is savage. A first-class lion is priced at 150,000 denarii, the single highest number anywhere in the schedule. The same document pays a farm laborer 25 denarii for a day of work, with his food included. 6,000 working days for one animal. 16 to 20 years of a man's life walking in a circle inside a crate. The same edict prices a pound of purple silk at that level too. In the official mind, a lion was not livestock. It was a luxury fabric that could bite. And the state wrote out that tariff for the animals in far more detail than it ever wrote one for the men who were sent in to fight them. They came in through a holding compound outside the Praenestine Gate, with a smaller one on the Chelian Hill, and a tunnel running from it toward the arena. Under the arena floor there were 32 trapdoors, and at the peak of it, around 60 winches, each one turned by 4 men standing on each of its 2 levels. There is no engine anywhere in that machine, and no animal turning it either. The special effect was men in the dark, winding, listening for a cue they could not see. The cage rises, the trapdoor opens, and 150,000 denarii walks out into the sunlight. The hunter who took it alive in a net, somewhere in North Africa, was on 25 denarii a day. He is on the mosaic. He is not on the price list. Every man in that chain was paid less than the freight he was handling, and the freight was dead before the afternoon was over. The catcher never saw the price. The shipper never saw the arena. The crowd never saw the invoice. Each of them handled one link and none of them saw the chain. This is also the part of the machine with no reason at all to be merciful. A spared man could fight again next month. A spared lion was an expense with no event attached to it, which is why the numbers for animals reach us round, enormous and repeated, and the numbers for men reach us careful, banded, and written into law. Rome was not indifferent to life. Rome had a price for it, and knew exactly where that price sat on the sheet. None of this was paid for by the people in the seats. Getting into the Colosseum cost nothing at all, free and ranked to the centimeter. Under Augustus's seating law, the first 14 rows belonged to men who met the equestrian census. 400,000 sesterces of property. Senators had their own chairs at the rail, with their names cut into the stone. Women, whatever they were worth, were sent up to the top of the building. So nobody bought a ticket, and everybody in that building could see exactly what everybody else was worth. The seat was the price tag. Somebody else paid. In Rome, that meant the emperor. In the provinces, it meant the local man who wanted the next office and had to buy his way toward it. It could ruin him, and the Senate knew it, which is why limits on the budget of a show keep reappearing in the record for 200 years and keep having to be reissued. Here is what the top of that market looked like when nobody was holding it down. Tiberius wanted retired stars back on the sand. Suetonius says he paid them 100,000 sesterces each for a single appearance. A legionary at the time earned somewhere around 1,000 sesterces in a year of service. One afternoon of one retired fighter cost what 100 soldiers cost for a year. The most expensive labor in the empire was nostalgia. Then it gets stranger. Commodus went down into the arena himself and invoiced the city for the privilege of watching him do it. Two ancient writers, one of them a senator who was sitting in the building, put it at around 1,000,000 sesterces for every day he appeared. One of those two is famously unreliable and fond of round numbers, so take the figure as an order of magnitude. The order of magnitude is the whole point of it. His father had spent an entire reign doing the same arithmetic from the opposite end of the ledger. With a war on the Danube to fund and plague moving through the provinces, Marcus Aurelius did not impose an emergency tax on anybody. He held a sale, 2 months of it, in the Forum of Trajan. Gold cups, crystal, marine, his wife's silk gowns, jewelry that had belonged to Hadrian. The most powerful man alive ran a public rummage sale of his own furniture, rather than send the bill to provinces that had not asked for the war. Afterwards, he let the buyers bring everything back and take their money again, and asked none of them any questions about it. And it was this same man who signed the ruling that capped what a fighter was allowed to cost. The price bands from that bronze table in Spain, which is what the cap really tells us. The cost of human beings had climbed so far that it had stopped being a matter of taste and become a matter of state. Meanwhile, the building kept sending bills of its own. Lightning took the upper timber floors in 217. The repairs ran about 23 years and 3 emperors, because the money kept running out halfway. When it was finally finished, they struck a coin to announce it. One biographer says Alexander Severus paid for part of that work with the tax taken from the brothels, money the treasury itself regarded as unclean. That source is unreliable and says so on nearly every page, but the motive it records is the interesting part. Dirty money was acceptable, as long as it went into a building instead of a budget. After the earthquake of 443, the prefect of the city rebuilt the place out of his own pocket and had his name carved into it. That inscription is still there, which is the shape of the ending in one line. A public building stops being publicly funded and starts depending on one rich man at a time for as long as rich men feel like it. The games did not end with a ban. Gladiators fade out of the record around 404. The animal hunts run on until 523. There is a legend about a monk walking onto the sand to stop it all. What the accounts show is duller and much heavier. The West ran out of money, and nobody could afford the show. A building that expensive does not simply get abandoned. It gets repurposed, again and again, by whoever happens to be standing closest to it. By about 1200, a baronial family, the Frangipani, were holding the Colosseum as a fortress, a private castle in the middle of Rome, with the arches bricked up. Around them and after them, the monks of Santa Maria Nova were renting the inside of it out. They kept that up for roughly 5 centuries. Workshops in the arcades, stables, housing, excavation under the arena floor turned up the drain pipes the tenants had laid in for themselves. The archaeologists who published it reached for a word that is hard to unhear afterwards. They called the place a condominium. By 1386, a third of the building had been signed over to a religious brotherhood. The amphitheater had shareholders. Then an earthquake brought down the outer wall along the south side and left the largest pile of cut stone in Europe lying in a city that was busy building churches. The rubble was not cleared away. It was sold. Marble facing went into the kilns and came back out as quicklime, in a quarter of Rome that ended up named after the burning. The finest marble in the world was worth more as mortar than as marble, and the ovens were standing right there. And the stone did not leave in the night, on the quiet. It left on paper, with permission, in daylight. Pope Eugene IV issued a brief threatening penalties on anyone who carried off so much as the smallest stone from the ruins. Within about 20 years, the same curia was selling permits to take it away by the cartload and keeping the money. In 1452, one contractor removed 2,522 cartloads of travertine from the Colosseum. In 9 months. That is not a story about barbarians. That is a delivery count. Somebody sat down with a pen and totaled it up, the way you total up any job that went well. The name attached to it, Giovanni Foglia of Como, rests on a single line in an archive, so hold the name loosely. The count does not depend on the man. There is a better-known story about a cardinal. Farnese asked his uncle the Pope for the right to take as much stone as he could move in 12 hours. He is said to have put 4,000 men on the site before the clock started. It is a famous story, and nobody can produce the license, so take it the way Rome told it. Rome did have a verdict on what the great families were doing. It was written anonymously and pinned to a talking statue, which is how the city published what it could not say aloud.
Quod non fecerunt barbari, fecerunt barbarini.
What the barbarians did not do, the barbarini did. By legend, not by document, but the palaces are real, and so is the missing wall. The plans got stranger as the value dropped. Sixtus V commissioned a design to convert the arena into a wool factory, with housing for the workers inside it. He died that August, and the factory died with him. His architect was later removed for embezzlement, which is a comment of its own. In 1700, Clement XI walled up the arches and turned the arena into a store for manure, raw material for saltpeter, for the powder works. The most famous building in the world spent part of the 18th century as a dung heap with a strategic purpose. And all the way through it, the metal was going. Look at any photograph of that outer wall. The whole face of it is covered in holes. Those are not weather. Some 300 tons of iron clamps held the travertine together, and they were dug out of the joints one at a time and melted down. Every hole in that wall is a place where somebody made a decision about the price of scrap metal, which closes the sentence the inscription opened. The building went up ex manubiis, out of the plunder one army carried home from a war. 15 centuries later, it became the plunder, licensed, priced, carted away by the load, with signatures on both sides of the deal. The quarrying finally stopped in 1749, when Benedict XIV consecrated the ruin to the memory of the Christian martyrs. There is no evidence that a single Christian was ever executed in the Colosseum. The Catholic Encyclopedia says so itself. Before the 16th century, nobody had even claimed it. So the building whose law priced a man's death at 50 times his sweat was saved, in the end, by a story that nobody has ever been able to prove. Rome could put a number on everything inside it: the fighter, the lion, the seat, the stone. The only thing that ever protected it had no price at all.